China's negotiators are expected to return to the United States this week for the 11th round of high-level trade talks. This came despite new and unexpected twists that China-U.S. trade negotiations seem to have run into over the weekend. Chinese analysts have highlighted the Chinese willingness to solve the dispute by negotiations regardless of what the U.S. is saying. At this moment, we won't join in the wild speculation as to what the U.S. will do come this weekend, nor how the Chinese will respond. Instead, as we are about 1 year since the trade tensions erupted, let's look back and try to identify some of the tactics used by the Trump administration. Is it part of a broader doctrine? Also, while some have focused on how the trade war has hurt the Chinese economy, let's turn it around and ask the same question of the U.S. economy as a result of these tactics. I'm pleased to be joined in our studio in Beijing by Professor Gong of the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. From New York, Teng, President of the America-China Public Affairs Institute, and from Boston, Professor Ravi Ramamurti, an emerging markets expert at Northeastern University. Gentlemen, welcome to the points. First, as I said, let's get to the task to try to identify some of the tactics that President Trump or the Trump administration has been deploying while dealing with China. And just looking back, a very brief look back at the history of the trade war. We were talking about March last year, where President Trump signed a memorandum directing to file a WTO case against China for so-called discriminatory licensing practices, to restrict investment in key technology sectors, and to impose tariffs on Chinese products. The Chinese side considered this to be the official first shot of the so-called trade war. Then in May, U.S. and Chinese representatives met for the first time, and in July, the tariffs officially came into effect. Now, as we're speaking, the U.S. collects 25% on $50 billion worth of high-tech imports from China and 10% on $200 billion worth of other goods. So, Professor Gong, let me go to you first. What are some of the tactics that you can identify throughout this 1 year of engagement between the U.S. and Chinese negotiating teams and governments, basically?
Well, he shows a pattern of setting up something quite strong initially. You can call it bluff, or you can call it whatever you like to call it. And he usually does this through tweeting. I think this is, one of his trademark negotiating tactics, sort of described in his book. By the way, the book is actually not written by himself, and he's another author writing this book for him, the so-called the art of the deal. So I think this is the kind of thing he uses a lot, so-called introducing shocks and surprises to the negotiating table in order to gain some strength and some benefits. I think at the end of the day, these tactics are not very productive. I mean, it's not productive, at least for this round.
Okay, let's talk about the effects of these tactics in just a moment. Let me go to our guest in the United States, to Mr. Teng, for instance. Do you agree? Do you see these the twists and turns in the negotiations so far, some kind of a set of tactics, or do you see it as a pattern or a doctrine emerging, Mr. Teng?
I do think that this is a tactic for President Trump. This is something, not just something he deployed when he became president, but he's been doing this all his life. But this type of tactics also bring the element of surprise. Is intended as a pressure, but also brings consequences.
Mr. Teng, you say this is a tactic. In what words would you describe this tactic? Is it a shock and awe? Is it, to surprise and to brinksmanship in an economic term, Mr. Teng?
I would say that it's bullying. It's basically, it's not, it's just enforcing the other person, catch them by surprise, and hoping he can net more other than negotiation. But I think that he probably is miscalculated this time, because I think because of his latest tactic, he probably hardened China's position. For the whole year, China's been giving in, trying to get a deal. But right now, I think that he will harden China's position.
Professor Ramamurti, what is your answer to the same question? What are we seeing here over the past year? Not just any one particular incident, but putting the dots together.
Well, in terms of tactics, I would just add that you asked for a couple of words, and the words that come to my mind are to be unpredictable. That's very much a trait of characteristic of his negotiating approach, and also to be unconventional. He has broken from many policies and positions of the U.S. over the last few decades, and he's shown that he's not afraid to do that. Now, in terms of, is there a broader,
Go ahead, please.
Please.
Okay, I was going to ask.
In terms of a broader strategy, I was going to say that in terms of broader strategy, I think there is probably a broader strategy of trying to some extent contain China's economic rise.
So basically, you answered the question I was going to ask you. So you think that these unexpectedness, these unconventional practices are kind of intended outcome of, or is kind of by design instead of, you know, just the way that he sees and handles situation, that he doesn't know what he's doing, Professor Ramamurti?
Yeah, no, he I think views unpredictability. Even during the election campaign, he mentioned that the U.S. tends to be very predictable. It would announce what it was going to do ahead of time. He didn't approve of that, and he believed that there is some value in being unpredictable. And he actually keeps, I think, even many of his advisors guessing on what his next move might be. And some things he says he doesn't act on, other things he says he does act on. And so he has developed a certain credibility for being seemingly irrational. So you don't know what he might or might not do.
Let's take a look at one tweet that he sent out just most recently, and I want to focus on the power of that device he has in his hand, especially every morning when he gets up. This tweet, which was sent out on May the 6th, says that the U.S. by President Trump says that the U.S. has been losing for many years $600 to $800 billion a year on trade. With China, we lose $500 billion. Sorry, we're not going to be doing that anymore. I don't want to focus on the correctiveness, whether these numbers are true or not. I don't even want to focus on whether what he says makes sense, but just the mere fact that every now and then we're seeing these tweets seemingly manipulating the kind of public narrative, the topics that's being discussed in the media. How much of a factor is that in President Trump's negotiating tactics, John?
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree with that. There's no meaning to judge the factual basis in all his statements in his tweets. It doesn't matter. I mean, there's a Washington Post has kept a record of how many lies have made or misleading statements, and the number has been hitting 10,000 misleading information so far he has released. So there's not much of a meaningfulness in dissecting what is true or what's not true. And clearly these words he are using are just emotional words, they're misleading words, they're meant to sway those people who don't have a clear judgment about the facts and about the theory of trade. But I think this kind of a statement does have an impact on a lot of people in the United States. People who tend to resonate with his position, people who lose out through the globalization process, for people who steadfastly vote for him in the past. His so-called base in the United States, mostly in those Rust Belt states, and his statement probably would be attracting to these people.
Mr. Teng, just now you used the word bully. You described President Trump's tactic as some kind of bully. So how would you describe this Twitter in his hands in the past, or in the on the school campus you would see boy with a stick maybe, or a brick? Is that a similar thing that we're seeing here with these tweets?
Yes, this tool is actually unprecedented. There's no president of the United States was able to use something so directly, unfiltered, and without really even consultation with his closest team. When he sent out these kind of messages, I think not only caught a lot of people by surprise, including his own team. Sometimes they will say one thing and then his Twitter will say something else. I agree with John that this is really appeal to the base, which about a third of the Americans who are his hardcore base. They voted for him, and they believe him. But certainly this tweet, in terms of the numbers, is way out of the fact in terms of the trade deficits.
Professor Ramamurti, that leads to my next question, which is the domestic politicking, if I can put it in this way, especially now we're getting closer to his expected announcement of running for re-election, right, for a second term as President of the United States as we get closer to the 2020 U.S. presidential election. How much is the tweets and the trade negotiation with China being used either to distract from other topics that have been bothering him, or to be used as some kind of cards to win more support from his so-called bases?
Yeah, I mean, this, I said he's unconventional, and this is a part of the unconventionality, because for the Republican Party to not take a free trade position is unconventional. And yet he has taken that position and has proved quite popular with his base. And I therefore think that will continue as we approach the election season. You know, being rhetoric against free trade has become very popular now in the U.S. across the spectrum of the political parties. So I expect that that will continue. But I think right now the immediate incentive, I think, for the president is to try to wrap up a deal that he can say was a very good deal for the U.S. in time for the election, so that some of the orders for farmers expected to come from China as a result of this deal will take effect fairly soon, because they'll have to start planting soon, and if they don't plant now, they will not be able to export in time before the elections.
Yeah, Professor Ramamurti, but it seems that he's playing a very dangerous game here, right? On the one hand, he needs to have a deal sooner than later, but on the other hand, he is doing or saying things that could put the prospect of this deal into jeopardy, Professor Ramamurti.
I think he's comfortable doing that, because he goes to the brink, but he also pulls back when he has to. And so I suspect this is just a tactic. That piece of it, the timing of this, is probably a tactic to speed up the process, make sure the deal is not delayed, to put some last-minute pressure for concessions, or to prevent sliding back on concessions that may have already been made. I don't think it will endanger the deal, and I think he would very much have an eye on that and make sure the deal does actually happen.
Professor Gong, how much confidence, why does President Trump have so much confidence that whatever he says or even whatever he does, that the Chinese are not going to walk away? Is that going to be the case? And what kind of process has it been for the Chinese negotiators to come to realize what they're dealing with?
Well, I think these tweets are clearly directed at American people or his base. He's not talking to the negotiating team on the China side. And you know, the delegation from China, they know the facts, they know what's going on, and they've been keeping close touch with Ambassador Liu. So they're not going to be persuaded by or infected by his but I did want to make a point that I'm still very optimistic about reaching an agreement here, because the fact that the Chinese delegation is going, the fact that Vice Premier is going, testified the seriousness of the Chinese government's position, that they're about to come up with some kind of a trade agreement with the United States.
Yeah, what kind of process, though, from your understanding, it has been for the Chinese government, for the Chinese negotiators to come to understand that sometimes they're just dealing with some kind of negotiation tricks or bluff, instead of real intention to walk away and see the worst coming into reality? Well,
I mean, he has been doing this for so many times that people are used to that. I mean, we have a saying here in China that if you cry wolf 3 times, people are not going to believe in you. So, I don't think this kind of a tactics is going to be effective to a professional team of negotiators. The Chinese delegation, as I said, they know the facts, they know both sides' strength, they know both sides' positions, and know how much we can compromise, how much we can concede, make concessions at this negotiating table. So it's not going to be swayed by a few tweets, especially these tweets doesn't make any sense at all.
Hopefully. Well, a little bit of time left. Let me just come briefly to what has happened to the U.S. economy over the past year, especially since tariffs have gone into effect as a result of all of the things that we talked about. In terms of trade deficit, for instance, statistics which came out earlier this year from the U.S. Bureau of Economic economic analysis show that in 2018, the deficit in goods increased by over 10% to reach $890 billion, indeed a record high. Although at the same time, the surplus the U.S. enjoys in services also registered a 6% increase to $270 billion. So in short, trade deficit, something that President Trump has been criticizing very harshly and has been vowing repeatedly to correct, has actually been even made stronger, more prominent. Mr. Teng, how do you look at this kind of discrepancy between the intention of President Trump and the actual outcome of what we're seeing?
Well, I think that President Trump, he had a campaign promise and he had campaign rhetoric, but his thinking and his assumptions are far from reality. And I think that most of the business people knows that, and I think it's reflected in the stock market when he made a surprise tactic like his Twitter about the tariff. I'm not so optimistic that the trade deal will be reached very soon. There's only one person in the entire world can decide whether the U.S.-China trade deal will happen, and that's Donald Trump himself.
Well, there are two people.
Both China and his negotiation team are working to make this happen. But I think he is the one who's going to be delaying it maybe for some time to come.
Well, we're going to keep a very close watch on the situation. Again, we're not going to speculate what's going to happen. We only see what the U.S. does and then how the Chinese react. Many thanks to my guests, Professor Gong of the University of International Business and Economics. From New York, Fred Teng, President of the American-China Public Affairs Institute, and from Boston, Professor Ravi Ramamurti from the Northeastern University.